week, and I probably shouldn't tell you this, but your pastor pulled a couple of all-nighters this week. And I definitely shouldn't tell you this, but I'm getting a little old for that. I just am, you know, it's, you know, it was for a good cause, so it was okay. But my last night, you know, I'm done with this, and I'm pretty exhausted, and I've got the 4-day growth of beard, and the dust, and the dirt, and I'm sitting there and thinking, wow, Mary, Elizabeth, the Magnificat. What can I possibly say? Did you catch those beautiful words? And the translation that you have says, my soul glorifies the Lord. But every time I hear it in my head, my soul magnifies the Lord. It's so beautiful. I imagine that conversation, you know? I mean, what kind of conversation is that? Here comes Mary, and all of a sudden her older cousin says, well, why do I deserve this visit from the mother of my Lord? And Mary immediately says in response, my soul now magnifies the Lord. Imagine I had a conversation like that. I mean, I imagine you're visiting some of my cousins in upstate New York. I live on a farm in upstate New York. I show up, I pull the old Lincoln up there, and I step out of the car, and there's my cousin. You know, there's my cousin. And he says, well, to what do I owe this visit, preacher? And I say, my soul now magnifies. It just doesn't happen like that, does it? Well, Mary just found out she's pregnant. Mary just had, if you were to read what just comes before that, Mary just found out she's pregnant. The story goes that an angel visits Mary. It happens to be the angel Gabriel. An angel visits Mary when she's pregnant. And it's really easy to get caught up in the human aspects of the story. It's very evocative. I heard a story on the news the other day about a woman who collects nativity scenes. She had 1,400 of these things in her house, nativity scenes. And what was interesting is she was not even a Christian. No, I'm not a Christian. But she was fascinated by the human aspects of this story. And it is fascinating. I think we're meant to be fascinated by it. We're meant to empathize. Here's a young girl. I say Mary might have been anywhere from 13 to 16 years old. Mary's about 13, 14, 15, 16. She's a teenager. And she finds out that she is pregnant. And the text goes that she hurries. She makes haste. She flees to the home of her cousin, Elizabeth. And we're not told why. At least we're not directly told why. But I think it might be because Mary has this idea that Elizabeth is going to understand. Elizabeth's going to understand. And this is not something that you can talk about readily. I would imagine it would be difficult enough for a young woman today who is, let's say, 14. And is she going to come up to her mom or her dad? Is she going to say, hey, guess what? An angel came to my room and said, I'm pregnant. I'm going to have a baby. Maybe not. Is she going to go and tell her best friend? And today they need to make a text message out of it. But Mary flees to the home of her cousin, her older cousin Elizabeth. And my guess is that is because Elizabeth just might understand. After all, Elizabeth, who's much older, was said to be barren. Couldn't have any children. And as the angel said, Elizabeth is now 6 months pregnant. So maybe Elizabeth will understand. After all, Elizabeth just might be prepared for oddities, for strange things. So here we have the very young girl who's pregnant. And here we have, what shall we say? What's the expression? Woman of a certain age. I guess it's good to have someone you can turn to. Do you have anybody like that in your life? This is just an aside. Brothers and sisters, if you have somebody in your life who understands, if you have somebody like that, treasure that person. Get down on your knees and thank God for that person. Because that's a gift. That's a rare, rare gift. The church is often preoccupied by something. And I will tell you, I've been preoccupied by this. Preacher types get preoccupied by this. Churches get preoccupied by it. It's a concept. It's an idea. It's what you probably heard. And depending on what kind of church you come from, you may think right on, and you may be very uncomfortable, and you may start to feel it's getting a little warm in here when I say this. Church is really preoccupied with an idea. Has anybody ever asked you? Maybe you ever asked someone, are you born again? Are you born again? Has anybody ever asked you that? Or have you ever asked someone that? Are you born again? Churches seem to be preoccupied. When I grew up in a church where people were saying, well yes, we're Christian. We're Christian. But we're not that born again kind. And then from there, I moved to a church that was so loud, and so, I guess that's where I got some of the preaching stuff from. And it is so loud and so vivacious, and everybody was born again. If you weren't born again, you couldn't be a real Christian. I'm going to go out on a limb, and then I'm going to publish it all over the internet, I guess, and I'm going out on a limb here. And I want to suggest to you that potentially, that's not a very good question. In fact, it might be a really rotten question. And the reason I think it's a really rotten question is because, unfortunately, when human beings ask it, there's one intonation. Are you in? Or are you out? I mean, after all, by the time I got to that second church, born again basically meant that, okay, I got it going on. If I step off this curb and get hit by a bus, I know where I'm going. It ain't going to be so bad. On the other hand, if you're not born again, how do you like your SPF 1000 suntan lotion? You know what I mean? It was a way of asking who is in and who's out. Just in case you're wondering where this comes from. You're all familiar with the 3rd chapter of John. Among other things, that's Jesus in an encounter with a teacher of the law by the name of Nicodemus. And Jesus says to him, unless one is what? Yeah, well, the word there, by the way, in Greek, is anatheron. Anatheron is properly translated as born from above. Born from above. Colloquial translation is simply born again, and that's fine. That's fine. It's a whole sermon is what it is. It's a whole Bible study. But that's where that thought comes from. But I want to suggest to you, as we are almost through with the Advent season, and as we move into a time we call, well, most of you will call it Christmas, but from my very formalist background, I might call this the Nativity. This is a season that has a lot to do with birth. But did you notice something about that interchange between Mary and Elizabeth? Would you say that Mary was born again? You know what, I'm not sure we can answer that question the way that people usually ask it. But there is something we can know about Mary. The Eastern Orthodox Church, by the way, refers to Mary, I guess it's another one of those Greek lesson Sundays, as the Theotokos. The Theotokos is the bearer of God, the one who carries God. Here is Mary, and she is gestating the Son of God. And I don't know if we can answer the question whether Mary is born again, at least not in the way that most American Christians might ask that question, but what is true, we can tell from this text, is that God is about to be born out of Mary. God is growing inside of Mary. God is about to emanate from Mary. God is about to be nurtured by Mary. God is going to be fed by Mary. Think about that for a second. It's a little bit reverse of what most people think of. Maybe the question is Advent and subsequently this Christmas nativity season. Maybe a far more important question of, gee, are you born again? Are you in or are you out? to gestate God? Can God grow up inside of you? Are you willing to give birth to God in your life? Can you let God be born again in your lives? So, Mary comes into the presence of her cousin Elizabeth, whom I'm assuming is her solace, and something extraordinary happens. Elizabeth, who's also carrying a child, the child leaps in her womb. Now, I thought about that, and I'm tempted to get real poetic and philosophical about it, but I'm a man. And I don't know. I mean, I can't, praise be to God, I can't experience these things. I can't. But the idea of the child leaping inside of her, Elizabeth is already 6 months. She's 6 months gone here. The child. I mean, I don't know how good that felt. But I'm guessing that was pretty convulsive. And the question is, what can we learn from this? Mary, who is giving birth to God, who is filled with God, comes into the presence of her cousin Elizabeth. And that which is in Elizabeth, the life that is in Elizabeth, convulses, jumps, moves. And maybe this is the message this text has for us. If we are willing to let God be born in us, when we come into others' presence, can we make them jump? Can we make them convulse? Can we make all that is within them respond, change, transform? I was talking about my younger years in a conservative church, and I was brought up to never talk about two things. I've said this before. I was brought up to never talk about two things. Thing number one, you never talk about religion in polite company. Thing number two, you know what thing number two is. You never talk about politics in polite company. Well, I guess I'm still working on that honor your father and your mother thing, because I haven't stopped talking about religion and politics ever since. But I think Mary may have ascribed the same thing. After all, another thing that I think of when I think of Mary is something that we're told she did at least twice when something extraordinary happened. When the angel came to Mary and said, "Okay, Mary, all right, girlie, you're going to have a baby." And she goes, "Baby, I haven't got a boyfriend." And the angel says, "It's okay, it's going to be the Holy Spirit." And Mary says, "Yeah, right." No, she doesn't say that. Mary says, "Let this be unto me as the Lord would have." And Mary ponders this in her heart. You remember that phrase? Mary ponders this in her heart. You know, she doesn't tell anybody. She keeps it inside. She just ponders it in her heart. And the other place that we know where Mary ponders things in her heart is about 12 years later. 12 years later, and Jesus and Mary and Joseph and the brothers and the sisters and the cousins and the in-laws and the outlaws are taking this caravan, see, in one of the temple. They get to the temple, and they do their business, but they do what they got to do in the temple. And then they leave. And Mary is walking along, and Joseph's walking along, and James is probably there too, and all of a sudden, Joseph says to Mary, "Where's Yahshua?" And Mary says, "What do you mean, where's Yahshua? I thought he was with you." "Well, you saw him last." Sure enough, he's back in the temple. And You know how the story goes. They go looking for him and they say, why have you abused us like this, kid? What have you done? And Jesus, man, he wasn't a tough kid. Gee, Mom, Dad, didn't you know I must be about my Father's business? And again, Mary is pondering this in her heart. Mary does a lot of pondering in her heart. But during this encounter with Elizabeth, with this person she trusts, with this person she's looked to for solace, this is one place where Mary did not ponder it in her heart. Mary magnified the Lord. Mary glorified the Lord. My soul magnifies the Lord. Now, what does this mean to magnify? Make it bigger, to make it greater, to make it more obvious. Mary is magnifying the Lord. This Advent season, we've talked about peace. We've talked about hope. We've talked about joy. Today is a Sunday for love. And those are all wonderful concepts. But they're going to remain concepts. They're going to stay just concepts. For example, peace. Peace. Sometimes I will pray, and I learned this from one of my mentors, and it seems like a funny thing to say. I will sometimes thank God that we live in a land of relative peace. That sounds like we're damning with faint praise. But it is a land of relative peace. After all, I'm not going to rehash the news. But let me ask you something. Have you ever known a time when America was not at war? When was the last time America was not at war? Oh, no, sure, we don't experience this very much. We have great gulfs of time between the time we experience armed conflict on our native soil. There are a precious few years when we have not been engaged in armed conflict. You've heard me talk about this before. We move from the war to end all wars. The ink is hardly dry on the peace treaty when we decide to do it all over again. World War I, the war to end all wars, brings us to World War II. World War II. We have a little bit of post-war prosperity, and well, we barely got through World War II before we entered into something else called the Cold War. While we're experiencing the Cold War, we go into the Korean War. We have Vietnam. Wait, Vietnam was not quite a war, was it? It was a military action or some such. I don't need to go through all of this. Peace is an elusive concept. Ask people who are living in Sandy Hook, Connecticut, how they feel about joy. Ask the mothers whose children are on war how they feel about hope. Find the man sleeping on the sewerway and ask him how he feels about love. These things are going to remain concepts until we can allow God to be born in us, until we are willing to allow our souls to magnify God. Make no mistake about it. This beautiful, horrible, vivacious, dying world is crying out. It's groaning. It is awaiting the revelation of the children of God. Those who will allow God to be born in their lives. Those who will magnify God. That's my hope, that's my prayer for all of us this Christmas season. As we move into this time, what some call the season of light, may God be born in us.